Chapter 1. The bell at Aurelian Academy did not ring so much as it sang, a long, silver note that rolled down from the Hall of Lineage and settled over the courtyard like frost. Every year it meant the same thing. The new students would walk beneath the Arch of Origin, and by the time they walked out the other side, they would know exactly where they stood for the rest of their lives. Michaela stood at the very end of the line, arms crossed over her chest, watching frost bloom and vanish on the archway's black stone. Beyond the courtyard walls, the towers of Aurelian rose in tiers up the hillside, the Hall of Lineage at the summit, gleaming white and gold even at dusk, and below it the lecture halls, the shifting yards where students practiced holding partial forms without tearing their own clothes to ribbons, the aviaries where griffinkin roost in the eaves and shrieked at the moon. The long green sweep of the dueling meadows where wraithhounds were sometimes loosed for tracking lessons and could be heard, some nights, baying at nothing at all. It was, everyone agreed, the most beautiful school on the continent. Michaela had spent 3 years learning exactly how little beauty had to do with kindness. She'd watched this ceremony from the outside for 3 years now as a kitchen hand, an errand girl, anything the academy would let a foundling do to earn her keep before she was finally old enough to be dragged through the arch herself. She'd carried trays past first-year processions, swept frost off the flagstones the morning after, listened through the kitchen door to the cheering and the crying and the low-murmured names of bloodlines old enough to have their own wings in the library. She'd imagined her own turn 1,000 times, lying awake in the servants' quarters under the kitchens, and none of the imaginings had made her feel any less like she wanted to be sick now that it was finally, actually happening. "You're not nervous," said the boy behind her, Percy, thin and quick-eyed, the only person at Aurelian who'd ever bothered to learn her name before he learned her rank. "You've got a face like you're about to be executed." "I'm not nervous," Michaela lied. "I already know what I am. Nobody knows until the mark comes up." "I know." She'd known since she was 6 years old, and a healer had pressed 2 fingers to her sternum during a fever and murmured, half to himself, "There's nothing here to read." She had spent 12 years since then waiting for the rest of the world to catch up to what her body had already told her. The line moved. Torchlight slid gold over dozens of nervous faces, sons and daughters of houses, whose names were etched into the academy gates, all of them certain, in the specific, unbothered way of people who had never had reason to doubt themselves, that they would walk through that arch and come out shining. Somewhere ahead of her in the line, a girl with ice-pale braids and a fur-trimmed collar far too fine for a first year was already holding court among a cluster of admirers, describing in bored, carrying tones exactly which color she expected her mark to be. That was Cassia Thorne. Michaela knew the name the way everyone at Aurelian eventually learned every important name, second-hand and early, a warning passed along with the salted dinner. The Thorns had spent 3 generations one careful step behind the Ashbournes in influence, and Cassia wore that almost but not quite the way some people wore a grudge, constantly and close to the skin. "Foundlings shouldn't even be allowed through the arch," Cassia was saying, not quite quietly enough as Michaela passed. "It's not real curiosity, is it, finding out what nothing is made of?" A few of the girls around her laughed. Michaela did not turn her head. She had learned a long time ago, in a kitchen full of people who thought servants couldn't hear insults spoken over their heads, that the fastest way to lose a fight was to prove you'd heard it land. Michaela had no house. She had a wooden token-stamped foundling, issued the night she was left wrapped in gray while at the base of the academy's outer stair, no note, no name, nothing but a birth month scratched into the wood by whoever had found her. Aurelian took in foundlings because an old law required it, and because it made the academy look generous in front of visiting nobility. It did not require the academy to make foundlings feel welcome once they were inside. When her turn came, she stepped beneath the arch and the stone above her flickered, not with light, but with its absence, a strange dark ripple like a held breath. A murmur went through the crowd of onlookers. "Faint reading," the Warden of Origins announced, already turning to note it in the ledger before Michaela had even reached the other side. Practically unmarked. "Sit at the back." Uninspiring dim. The word the other students would use for the rest of her life, said sometimes with pity and mostly with contempt. She kept her spine straight and walked through anyway. Chapter 2. The Alpha Heir. If Michaela's mark was the quietest thing the Arch had produced in a decade, Leo Ashbourne's was the loudest thing it had produced in a century. The light that broke from his chest when he passed beneath the stone wasn't gold, like the noble houses, or silver, like the old magic families. It was a deep, furious bronze, so bright it threw shadows backward across the courtyard, and it didn't fade the way marks were supposed to. It kept pulsing, slow and steady, like something alive and awake and paying attention. Ashbourne, the warden said, and didn't need to say more. Everyone already knew the name. His father commanded the largest wolf legion on the continent. His grandmother's grandmother had signed the treaty that ended the long winter war. Leo had been raised knowing exactly what he was before he could talk, the way some children are raised knowing what color the sky is. He didn't smile when the crowd cheered. He never did. Smiling required believing that the outcome had ever been in doubt, and Leo Ashbourne did not waste effort on things that were never in doubt. He caught sight of the foundling girl on his way back to his row, hard not to, given how conspicuously empty the space around her had become. Other students shifting a half step away as if her faint mark might be catching. She wasn't looking down at her boots the way the other unranked students did. She was looking straight ahead, jaw tight, like she was daring the whole courtyard to say something to her face. Stubborn, he thought, and then thought nothing else about her at all, because there was nothing about a feint that was worth a second thought. That was simply how the world worked. Power in the blood, order in the world. His father had told him that before Leo was old enough to walk, and his father had never once been wrong about anything that mattered. He didn't know yet how badly that certainty was about to cost him. Chapter 3. A name learned the hard way. Their first real conversation happened 2 weeks into term, in the cold stone corridor outside the Applied Ward's classroom, and it was not, by any reasonable measure, a good one. Michaela had been carrying a stack of borrowed textbooks nearly as tall as she was. Feints weren't issued their own copies, on the reasoning that they were unlikely to need them for long, when Cassia Thorne's foot found its way, with the practiced innocence of long habit, directly into her path. The books went everywhere. So did Michaela, catching herself hard on one palm against the flagstones while half the corridor laughed. "Ashbourne, look," Cassia said, delighted, to the boy walking beside her. The dims finally found her level. Leo didn't laugh. He also didn't help her up, which Michaela would remember for weeks afterward with a specific, cold clarity, because at the time it seemed to matter more than anything else in the world, more even, than the humiliation of being sprawled on the floor in front of half her year. He simply looked down at her the way he might have looked at a puddle blocking his path, an obstacle, mildly inconvenient, entirely beneath comment. "You should watch where you're standing," he said. Not unkind exactly. Worse than unkind, indifferent. The tone of someone who had never once had to consider that the person on the floor might have somewhere to be, dignity to salvage, a whole life happening behind her eyes that had nothing to do with him. Michaela got to her feet without anyone's help, gathered her books with hands that shook only a little, and looked him dead in the eye. "You should watch where you're standing too," she said. "Someday it might matter more than you think." It wasn't clever. It wasn't even particularly cutting. But something about the flat, unafraid way she said it, no plea in it, no flinch, nothing but pure stubborn refusal to be smaller than the moment wanted her to be, snagged on something in him and stayed there long after he told himself to forget it. "Careful," Cassia said, delighted all over again. The dims got teeth. "Apparently," Leo said, and for reasons he couldn't have explained if pressed, he didn't smile the way Cassia expected him to, and he thought about the exchange, uselessly, on and off, for the rest of the day. That night, as he did most nights, Leo trained alone in the private yard reserved for his house, running the same forms his father had drilled into him since he was old enough to hold a practice blade without dropping it on his own foot. Commander Ashbourne did not believe in praise the way other fathers did. He believed in correction, delivered evenly and often, on the theory that a son who was never satisfied would never stop improving. "Power is the only apology the world accepts," he liked to say, usually right after pointing out some fresh flaw in Leo's footwork. "Everything else is just noise people make while they wait to lose." Leo had built his entire life around that sentence without ever once questioning whether it was true, because questioning it had never once seemed like an option available to him. He was the Ashbourne heir. The brightest mark the arch had thrown in 100 years. There wasn't room in the life that had been mapped out for him since before he could talk, for softness or curiosity about people who didn't matter, or, least of all, for the particular unsettled feeling that had lodged itself under his ribs since a faint girl on the floor of a corridor had looked up at him without an ounce of fear in her eyes and told him, calmly, that someday his own footing might matter more than he thought. He didn't understand yet why this sentence had stuck. He only knew that it had, the way a splinter sticks, small and easy to ignore, and somehow impossible to stop noticing anyway. Chapter 4. The dormitory they gave the Faints was the old grain tower on the north wall, 4 flights up, 1 window, a draft that never fully went away no matter the season. It had been a granary once. Before the academy outgrew its walls and needed somewhere to put the students nobody wanted to look at too closely, and it still smelled faintly of old chaff no matter how many seasons of incense the Faints burned trying to chase it out. Michaela didn't mind the climb. She minded the silence in the classrooms, the way instructors' eyes slid past her row without stopping, the way even the kindest teachers had learned to stop calling on students who'd never once produce a spell worth grading. Applied shifting was the worst of it, because it was the class where the gap showed most plainly. Half the students in her year could already hold a partial form, a ripple of fur along the forearm, a flash of feather at the collarbone, eyes gone gold and slit-pupilled for a heartbeat before sliding back to human, with the same unthinking ease Michaela used to tie her boots. The instructor, a broad, kind-eyed woman named Fair Wren who had once commanded a border legion of hawkshifters, tried harder than most to be fair about it, calling on Faints in turn even when she knew what the silence afterward would sound like. It didn't help much. A kindness offered inside a system built to be unkind only ever softened the edges. It never changed the shape of the thing. Beyond the classroom walls, the wider academy carried on in its usual half-wild rhythm. Griffinkin wheeling over the aviary roosts at dawn, the low unhurried thunder of centaur students crossing the outer fields on their morning runs, the occasional shriek of a wraithhound loosed for tracking drills that sent even seasoned upper years scattering for the nearest doorway. It was, Michaela had come to understand, a school built entirely for people who belonged in it, humming with a kind of casual, effortless magic that never once seemed to notice the small, quiet cracks in its own foundation. The students, it had already decided, long before they arrived, not to bother building a place for. She minded, most of all, how easy it was to start believing them. "You're not actually faint," Percy told her one night, sprawled on the floor of her room with a pilfered lantern between them, because Percy was faint too and had appointed himself her only friend within about 4 days of the sorting. "I've seen you pick locks with a hairpin faster than half the 6th years cast their opening wards. That's not nothing. Locks aren't magic. Everything's a little bit magic if you're clever enough about it." He grinned at her, easy and warm, and for a moment she almost believed him. Almost. Because the next morning in applied shifting, when the instructor called the roll of names to demonstrate a partial form shift and skipped straight over hers without pause, as though her name existed only to be crossed off a list, the almost curdled into something colder. She sat through the lesson watching classmates flicker between skin and fur, feathers and scale, easy as breathing, and felt the old familiar hollow open up under her ribs. "There's nothing here to read," the healer had said, all those years ago. Sometimes she wondered if he'd been right the first time, and everything since had just been the academy being too stubborn or too cruel to admit it. She didn't cry. She'd stopped letting herself do that in front of anyone years ago, and mostly stopped doing it alone, too. Crying had never once changed anything about her circumstances, and she'd decided, sometime around her 14th year, that energy spent on tears was energy she'd rather spend on almost anything else. Instead, she went to the empty training yard after curfew, the one behind the old grain tower that nobody bothered patrolling because nobody expected a Faint to have anywhere better to be, and she practiced the only thing the academy had never been able to take from her, refusing to quit. She ran forms she'd copied by watching through classroom windows, threw punches at a training post until her knuckles split, and told herself, every single night, the same quiet promise, that whatever she actually was, nobody was going to get to decide it for her without a fight. She didn't know that 4 floors up, in the tallest tower on the opposite side of the courtyard, Leo Ashbourne was standing at his window, unable to sleep, watching a small, stubborn shape run drills alone in the dark long after everyone else had given up on her, and feeling something he did not have a name for yet and did not want one. Chapter 5. A Challenge Made in Cruelty. The ranking duel took place at the end of every term in the Varia Arena, A bowl of white stone sunk into the hillside below the academy, old enough that moss had claimed the outer seats and nobody had ever bothered to clear it. Tradition dictated that students duel within their own rank. Tradition also permitted, in a clause nobody had invoked in 9 years, for a higher-ranked student to challenge someone far beneath them, a public demonstration. The old charter called it, delicately, of the natural order. It was Leo's inner circle who suggested it, not Leo himself. Kasha Thorne, in particular, whose family had spent 3 generations resenting how close the Ashbournes sat to the throne, watched Michaela lingering at the edge of the yard and decided that the fastest way to remind the school who mattered was to let its strongest student flatten its weakest. They cornered him after evening drills, the whole circle of them draped over the practice yard fence in the long gold light, Kasha perched on the top rail like she owned it. "You haven't challenged anyone all term," she said. "People are starting to say the Ashbourne heir's gone soft. People say a lot of things. People say the Dim's been getting ideas about herself. Sitting up straighter in ethics of rank like she thinks it's for her too." Kasha examined her nails, bored and pointed at once, the way she did everything. It'd be a mercy, honestly. Remind her where the line is before she embarrasses herself somewhere it actually matters. "It'll take you 30 seconds, she added when Leo didn't answer fast enough. "Less. You could probably do it half-shifted." Leo said nothing for a long moment, and in that moment he thought, unbidden, of a girl running drills alone at midnight, refusing an audience she'd never once had. Something in him, something new, something he didn't examine too closely, didn't like the idea. But refusing would have meant explaining why, and Leo Ashbourne had never in his life explained himself to anyone, least of all to people who were already looking for a crack in his composure to pry at. So he said, in the flat, bored voice he used for things he'd already decided didn't matter, "Fine. Put it on the board." By dinner the whole academy knew. By the next morning, so did Michaela, and so did the strange cold certainty that had lived in her chest since the day the arch flickered instead of shone, that this, finally, was going to be the day everyone found out for certain what she was. She wasn't afraid of losing. She'd been losing quietly her entire life. She was afraid of what it would feel like to lose in front of everyone at once. Chapter 6, Varia Arena. The whole academy turned out. Nobles from the city climbed down into the moss-eaten seats in furs too fine for the weather, murmuring bets to one another about how quickly it would end. Vendors who usually only appeared for the term-end championship matches had somehow heard about it anyway and set up carts along the upper rim selling spiced nuts and paper cones of shaved ice, because a mismatch like this one made for good theater even when, especially when, nobody expected the outcome to be in doubt. Professor Wren stood near the healer's tent with her arms crossed and her mouth set in a thin, unhappy line, the closest thing to protest her position allowed her. Percy sat in the front row with his knuckles white on the stone rail, unable to look away and unable to watch, muttering under his breath every prayer he half-remembered from a childhood he rarely spoke about. Kasha had claimed a seat with an unobstructed view and the smug, settled look of someone who had already decided how the afternoon would end and was only waiting for the world to catch up to her. "Don't blink," she told the girl beside her. "You'll miss it." Michaela stood at one end of the ring in her plain gray training clothes, and Leo stood at the other in his house colors, bronze light already flickering faint and restless under his skin like something eager to be let out, and for one strange moment their eyes met across the sand and neither of them looked away first. "I don't want to do this," Leo thought, with a clarity that unsettled him more than the thought itself. "I'm not going to give them the satisfaction of running," Michaela thought, and lifted her chin. The warden dropped the flag. Leo didn't wait. Waiting would have been its own kind of cruelty, prolonging a fight that everyone, including Michaela, knew the shape of before it started. He crossed the sand in a blur of bronze, speed, and struck once, and Michaela went down hard, breath punched out of her, ears ringing, the sky above the arena tilting sideways. "This is it," she thought, distantly, watching the clouds spin. "This is where I finally find out for certain." And then something in her chest, something that had been sleeping so long and so quietly that even she had stopped believing it was there, woke up. It didn't feel like power. It felt like a door swinging open somewhere behind her sternum, a door she hadn't known was there, letting in a wind that had been waiting on the other side for 18 years. Light poured off her, not gold, not silver, not bronze, but a deep, moving violet black, like the sky an hour before dawn, threaded through with something that looked impossibly like starlight caught mid-fall. The sand around her rippled outward in a slow ring. Every torch in the arena guttered at once and then flared higher. Somewhere in the stands, an old instructor from the History of the Lost Houses department rose halfway out of her seat, face gone the color of chalk, one hand pressed flat against her own mouth as if to keep a name from escaping it. Leo, already mid-stride toward the finishing blow that would have ended the match, felt something hit him that wasn't force at all. It was recognition, ancient and total, the kind of feeling a wolf gets in its blood a half-second before it understands danger with its mind, except underneath the danger was something else entirely. Something that felt disconcertingly like being looked at by someone who already knew him better than he knew himself. He stopped so fast his own momentum nearly took his feet out from under him, boots skidding a long gouge through the sand. Around the arena, 400 voices had gone utterly silent at once, the particular silence of a crowd that has just watched something happen that it has no framework to explain. Kasia in the stands had risen halfway to her feet without seeming to notice she'd moved, one hand pressed flat to her own chest as though she could feel the light from where she sat. Michaela rose off the sand without seeming to decide to. The violet-black light wrapped her like a second skin, and for one suspended moment she looked at her own hands as though they belonged to somebody else entirely. "Stand down," the warden was shouting, though whether at Leo or at Michaela, nobody could tell. "Stand down, both of you now." Leo took a step back instead of forward, which he would think about later for a very long time. The fact that his first instinct in the face of the strangest power he had ever felt was not to fight it, but to give it room. The light didn't attack anyone. It simply hung there, terrible and beautiful, until Michaela's knees buckled and the whole arena watched her crumple, unconscious, back onto the sand, and the light went out like a snuffed candle, leaving nothing behind but silence and moss, and 400 people who had just watched a faint outshine in alpha air. She woke 2 days later in the healer's wing, throat raw, every muscle aching as though she'd run the length of the continent. Thin morning light came through a high window, and somewhere beyond the curtain she could hear healers murmuring in the clipped, careful tones people use when they don't want to be overheard discussing something serious. Percy was asleep in the chair beside her bed, still wearing yesterday's clothes, a half-eaten roll gone stale on the table beside him where he'd clearly meant to eat it and forgotten the moment he sat down to wait for her to wake. "You're an idiot for staying," she rasped, and he woke with a start and nearly fell out of the chair with relief. "You're an idiot for almost dying," he shot back, voice cracking, and for a second neither of them said anything else, because there wasn't anything funny enough to say about how close it had actually been. The Academy, it turned out, had spent 2 days in quiet uproar. The Warden of Origins wanted the incident recorded as a marked irregularity and quietly buried. Half the noble families wanted Michaela expelled on the grounds that unstable, unregistered power was a danger to the student body. And one very old woman, Professor Ilse Corvain, who had taught history of the Lost Houses for 40 years to increasingly empty lecture halls because nobody thought old history mattered anymore, had requested, formally and in writing, to be the one to examine her. She came to Michaela's bedside alone, closed the door, and sat for a long moment just looking at her the way one might look at a ghost one had stopped expecting to see. "I need to ask you something," Ilse said finally, "and I need you to answer me honestly. Do you know anything about your birth mother?" "Nothing," Michaela said. "I was left at the stair. There wasn't even a note." "There was a note," Ilse said quietly. "It was destroyed by order the week you were found. I know because I was the one who found it first, and I read it before it was burned." She reached out and very gently touched 2 fingers to the center of Michaela's chest, the same place the healer had once pressed and found nothing at all. There was a lineage the great houses agreed, 300 years ago, could never be allowed to rise again. They called it a rebellion when it was really just a family refusing to be erased. I thought it had been erased. I have spent 40 years teaching children that it was erased, because that is what I was ordered to believe. Her eyes, pale and tired and suddenly very bright, held Michaela's. I was wrong, and so were they. And that, child, is going to be a very dangerous thing for you to be. It took Ilse another week to work up the courage to show her the rest of it, not because the old professor was cruel, but because she had spent 40 years learning exactly how much a single piece of truth could cost a person, and she wanted to be certain Michaela was ready before she handed her the heaviest one. "Your mother's name was Eloan," Ilsa said finally, one evening in the small stone office that smelled of dust and dried lavender, sliding a folded scrap of paper across the desk with hands that weren't quite steady. "She wasn't a great lady. She was a healer from a village 2 days south of here, who fell in love with a man whose bloodline she didn't learn the truth of until she was already carrying his child. By the time she understood what she was hiding, it was already far too dangerous to do anything but hide it better." Michaela unfolded the paper with careful fingers. The ink had faded to the color of old tea, but the words were still legible, still achingly plain. Asterisk, if you are reading this, then I could not keep her safe any other way. Her name is Michaela. Please, whoever finds her, let her believe she is ordinary. Ordinary children get to grow up, asterisk. She's alive, Michaela said. It wasn't a question. Not really. Something in her had simply known it the instant she saw the handwriting, the way you know a room is occupied before anyone speaks. She was 12 years ago when I last had word, Ilsa said gently. Living under another name, far from here, watched by people loyal to the old houses in case the bloodline ever resurfaced. I didn't dare send word to her before now. Any message could have been the thing that finally gave her away. She hesitated. I can't promise you she's still safe. I can only promise you that everything she did so that you would get exactly the kind of ordinary, unremarkable life she never got to have herself. I imagine that's going to be a strange thing to forgive her for, once you've spent your whole life wanting to be anything but ordinary. Michaela folded the letter back along its worn creases, careful as handling glass, and held it against her chest the way she imagined. Once, long ago, someone had held her. I don't need to forgive her, she said quietly. I need to find her. Then we will, Leo said from the doorway where he'd been standing long enough to hear most of it, and neither of them asked how long he'd been listening, because it didn't matter. He'd already made himself part of the answer, the same way he'd been quietly making himself part of every hard thing in her life since the day the arch had failed to shine for her. The Academy Council's solution, once the shock wore off into something more practical and more political, was pragmatic in the way institutions are pragmatic about problems they cannot make disappear, contain it, rather than confront it. Michaela's power was unregistered, unstable, and by every account of everyone who had seen it, dangerous in the wrong hands, including, possibly, her own. She needs controlled instruction. The council decided, under supervision from someone capable of matching her, should containment become necessary. There was exactly one student at Aurelian capable of matching what had come off Michaela in that arena, and everyone in the room knew it before his name was said aloud. Leo did not volunteer. He was volunteered by his own father, who saw in the arrangement an opportunity to keep a dangerous unknown close enough to watch, and did not yet understand that keeping it close was not remotely the same thing as controlling it. Their first supervised session took place in a training hall well below the main courtyard, thick-walled, warded 6 ways from Sunday by nervous instructors who clearly expected the worst. Torch brackets lined the walls at even intervals, each one fitted with a fresh containment rune that hummed faintly against the stone, and a healer had been posted outside the door with a satchel of emergency drafts, just in case. I didn't ask for this, Michaela said, arms crossed, the moment the door shut behind them, and it was just the two of them and the echo of dripping water somewhere in the old stone. Neither did I, Leo said. Good. Then we agree on something. We agree on exactly one thing, he said, and something in the dry, precise way he said it startled a short, unwilling laugh out of her before she could stop it. He noticed. He didn't say anything about it, but he noticed, and something in his chest, the part of him that had spent 18 years being trained never to be surprised by anything, filed the sound away like it mattered. So how does this work? She said, after a silence that had gone on a beat too long. You point, I flinch. We tell the council I'm properly terrified and everyone goes home satisfied? If it were that simple they wouldn't need me here at all. He circled her slowly, the way he might have sized up an opponent, though there was nothing aggressive in it, more like he was trying to see her from every angle before deciding what she actually was. What happened in the arena? Walk me through it. Not what it looked like. What it felt like from the inside, right before it happened. She hadn't told anyone that, Not Percy, not Ilsa, not the healers who'd prodded and measured her for 2 straight days. She almost didn't tell him either. But there was something about the flat, focused way he was looking at her, no pity in it and no fear, just genuine attention, that made the words come easier than she expected. Like a door, she said slowly. Behind my ribs. Like it had been shut so long I forgot it was even a door, and then you hit me, and it just opened. Leo went very still. That's not how a mark is supposed to work, he said, half to himself. Marks don't hide. They're not built to hide. Yours was built to. It was the first time either of them had said out loud what both of them had already started, separately and in secret, to suspect that whatever had happened to her in the arena hadn't been an accident of birth. It had been done to her on purpose by someone a long time before either of them had been born, and neither of them yet had any idea how far that particular truth was going to reach before it was through with them. The lessons were supposed to be about control. Mostly in the beginning, they were about 2 people who had spent their whole lives being defined by opposite ends of the same cruel system, learning grudgingly that the definitions didn't fit either of them as neatly as everyone had insisted. You flinch before you throw anything, Leo told her, 3 sessions in, arms crossed, watching her fail to summon so much as a spark on command, even though he'd watched her nearly bring down half the arena without meaning to. You're not afraid of the power. You're afraid of what happens after people see it. That's rich, coming from someone who's never had to be afraid of anything in his life. You'd be surprised, he said, and something flickered behind his eyes, old and tired and, for one unguarded second, entirely unlike the boy the whole academy thought they knew, before he shut the door on it again. Try again. Don't flinch this time. She tried again. It still didn't work. But she noticed, with some private irritation, that she wanted to try again for him in a way she had stopped wanting to try for anyone at Aurelian in a very long time. The sessions kept happening, twice a week and then 3 times, then whatever the council's schedule could be talked into, because though neither of them said this part aloud, not for a long while yet, both of them had quietly started arranging the rest of their days around them. Leo started arriving early. Michaela started staying late. Neither of them mentioned it to anyone, least of all to each other. You're doing it again, he told her one evening, when a summoned spark guttered out the instant it appeared, the way it always did the moment she noticed people watching. You keep looking at the door like you're waiting for someone to walk in and tell you to stop. Old habit. Break it. Nobody's coming through that door but the healer, and she's asleep by now. I'd bet good coin on it. A pause. Try picturing something else. Not the arena. Somewhere that isn't waiting for you to fail. She closed her eyes and, without entirely meaning to, pictured the tower roof at midnight. Empty sky, no one watching at all, and the spark that rose off her palm this time held steady for nearly 4 full seconds before it guttered out, longer than it ever had before. When she opened her eyes, Leo was watching her with an expression she didn't have a name for yet, something careful and startled and entirely unguarded, gone again almost before she registered it. There, he said, quieter than before. That's the door working the right way. It became, without either of them planning it, a kind of ritual, small stolen exchanges that had nothing to do with lineage or ranking at all. He learned that she hummed under her breath when she was concentrating and didn't know she did it. She learned that he took his tea so strong it was nearly undrinkable, a habit he admitted once, from years of pre-dawn training before his father woke, when strong tea was the only thing standing between him and collapsing face first onto the practice mats. He learned that she'd never once, in 18 years, been given a birthday, because nobody had ever known which day to celebrate, and without telling her why, he started quietly finding out, asking Ilsa, checking old foundling registries, piecing together a date from the month scratched into a wooden token nobody else had ever thought worth the trouble. It happened slowly, the way most true things happen. Not a single dramatic turn, but 100 small ones. The night he found her running drills alone after curfew and, instead of reporting her, sat down on the cold stone and started correcting her footwork without being asked. The afternoon she caught him staring at his own reflection in a practice mirror with an expression so lost it made her chest ache and didn't tease him about it, and he never forgot that she hadn't. The evening it rained and they got caught out past the training hall roof, laughing, actually laughing, both of them, at nothing, at everything, at how absurd it was that the Academy's most powerful heir and its least powerful foundling had ended up soaked to the skin and grinning at each other like idiots. I used to think power was the only thing that mattered, Leo admitted that night, quiet, watching rain slide off the eaves. My father built that into me before I could walk. I don't think I've ever once believed anything different. Do you believe it now? He looked at her for a long moment. Really looked, the way he hadn't let himself look at anyone since he was old enough to understand that looking too closely at people was a weakness his father would punish out of him. No, he said. Not anymore. It was, Michaela would think much later, the exact moment enemies stopped being the right word for what they were to each other. It would be weeks yet before either of them said so out loud, and when the moment finally came, late, on the training hall roof, rain long since stopped, stars out in force, it was nothing more than a kiss, careful and searching and long overdue, the kind that asked a question rather than answering one. Neither of them pulled away first. Aurelian held its lantern festival at the turn of every autumn term, an old tradition older even than the ranking system, when the whole academy, nobles and faints and everyone between, filled the courtyard with floating paper lanterns and let the wind carry them out over the dueling meadows until the sky looked like it had caught fire, gently on purpose. It was one of the only nights of the year when rank didn't seem to matter, if only because the dark made everyone equally hard to place. Leo found her at the edge of the crowd, half hidden by an old stone well nobody used anymore, a single unlit lantern in her hands. "You're supposed to release it," he said, coming to stand beside her, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers. "I know how a lantern works." "Then why are you still holding it?" She turned it over in her hands, the paper thin and warm where her fingers had been resting against it. "Because you're supposed to write something on it before you let it go. A wish, or a name, or whatever you most want the wind to carry somewhere you can't reach yourself." I never used to bother. Didn't seem like there was much point wishing for things when nobody around here was ever going to hand them to you anyway. And now, she didn't answer right away. Instead, she took the small charcoal stick from her pocket and wrote, in careful, deliberate letters along the lantern's paper side, a single word, Eloan, her mother's name, the only piece of her own history that had ever felt like it belonged entirely to her. Leo watched her light the small candle inside with a careful spark, watched the lantern catch the wind and lift, slow and golden, up into a sky already crowded with hundreds of others. "I never used to understand the point of this festival," he admitted, watching it go. "My father always said wishing was for people who didn't have the power to make things happen themselves. What do you think now?" "I think," he said, and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers without either of them quite deciding to let it happen, "that some things are worth wishing for even when you do have the power to make them happen yourself. Just so the wanting doesn't feel so lonely." They stood together a long while after that, watching the sky fill slowly with light, neither of them saying anything else, because for once there was nothing that needed saying that their joined hands hadn't already said better. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday, which was somehow the part that frightened everyone most afterward. No build-up, no warning, just an ordinary training session that went sideways in the space of a single held breath. Michaela had been working on holding her light steady under pressure, and Leo, testing her control the way he always did, pressed harder than either of them had tried before. The door in her chest didn't just open this time. It nearly tore off its hinges. Violet black light flooded the training hall, so fast the containment runes along the walls shattered one after another, small violent cracks like ice breaking underfoot, and for one terrible, endless second Michaela felt the same total unmooring she'd felt in the arena, the sense of being a passenger in her own body while something far older and far larger decided what happened next. She heard, distantly, Leo shouting her name. She heard the healer's satchel hit the floor outside as the door was flung open. And then, cutting through all of it, she felt his hands close around hers, not trying to fight the light, not trying to contain it the way the runes had, just holding on, steady and unafraid, the way he'd held on the night of the Lantern Festival. "I'm here," he said, voice rough but level, close enough that she could feel the words more than hear them over the roar of her own power. "You're not losing yourself. You're just remembering all of it at once. Breathe with me. Just breathe with me." She did. Slowly, unevenly, The light began to answer to her instead of the other way around, folding back down into her chest like a held breath finally let go, until the hall was quiet again except for the ragged sound of both of them breathing and the soft click and hiss of shattered runes cooling along the walls. "That's never happened before," she said, once she could trust her own voice again, staring at her own hands like she still wasn't entirely sure they belonged to her. "It's never had this much room to happen before," Leo said. "Every session, every ward we've pushed past, every piece of the old seal we've cracked without meaning to. It's not getting more dangerous, Michaela. It's getting more awake. There's a difference, even if it doesn't feel like one from the inside." Ilsa, when they told her the next morning, went very quiet and then very grave. "It means the seal is failing faster than any of us expected," she said, "which means we no longer have the luxury of moving carefully. If the council finds out how close it already is to breaking entirely, they will not wait for a hearing to decide what to do about it." She looked between the two of them, something like fear and something like fierce, protective pride warring plainly on her old face. "Whatever you intend to do to stop them getting there first, child, I would suggest you do it soon." By the time the Lantern Festival's paper ash had settled over the courtyard, there was no pretending anymore that the training sessions between the Alpha Heir and the Faint Girl were only about training. Half the academy had an opinion about it, and most of those opinions arrived at Michaela secondhand, filtered through whichever gossip chain happened to be fastest that week. Some of it was kind. Talia and the other Faints from the Grain Tower had started saving her a seat at dinner without being asked, a small, unremarkable courtesy that meant more to Michaela than she knew how to say out loud. Professor Wren, who had spent 3 years calling on Faints she knew would only ever answer in silence, began, without comment, assigning Michaela to demonstrate footwork alongside the year's strongest students, as though daring anyone in the room to object. Some of it was not kind at all. Cash's circle had taken to leaving small cruelties in Michaela's path the way some people leave traps. A shoved shoulder in a crowded corridor, a rumor about her mother whispered just loud enough to be overheard, an anonymous note slipped under her door that said only know your place in handwriting she never did identify. Michaela had grown up fluent in this particular language of contempt, and she had grown, over the years, remarkably steady at absorbing it without flinching. What she hadn't expected was how much angrier it made Leo than it made her. "You don't have to fight every battle that's about me," she told him, after she caught him standing very still and very white-knuckled outside a lecture hall where someone had chalked a cruel joke about her bloodline on the door. "I know I don't have to," he said. "I want to. There's a difference." He scrubbed the chalk away himself, sleeve dragging over stone until his knuckles were raw. "For 18 years I was taught that people like you didn't matter enough to be worth defending. I spent every day since the arena finding out how wrong that was. I'm not interested in going back to not noticing." It was, Michaela thought later, one of the more romantic things anyone had ever said to her, delivered with all the tenderness of a boy scrubbing chalk off a door in barely controlled fury, which somehow made it land harder than anything softer ever could have. It was Percy who broke first, 3 days after the roof. 3 days after half the academy had started whispering about the Foundling and the Alpha Heir. The whispers had reached every corner of Aurelian by then, carried on the same current that carried everything interesting through a school full of bored, ambitious teenagers. The kitchens, the laundry lines, the long tables in the dining hall where upper years traded gossip like currency. Kasha, predictably, had made it her personal mission to ensure the story lost nothing in the retelling. "The Dim's gotten her claws into him," she'd said, loud enough to carry, more than once. Wonder what that unregistered little bloodline actually wants. Michaela had learned to let it slide off her the way she'd learned to let everything else slide off her. What she hadn't expected, what she wasn't prepared for at all, was the look on Percy's face when he finally found her alone in the library stacks, because for the first time since she'd known him, he couldn't quite meet her eyes. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." She knew somehow, before he even started, the way you know a storm is coming from the particular color the sky turns. "Percy, my family didn't lose their rank in a duel like I told you," he said, all in a rush, like he'd been holding the words behind his teeth for years and they'd finally worn a hole clean through. "My family serves the council. Quietly. Off the books. We're the ones who watch the things the council doesn't want watched. I was placed here 2 years before you even arrived, Michaela. I was placed here to watch the foundling stare. To watch you. The betrayal landed exactly the way betrayal always does. Not as one single knife, but as 100 small realizations arriving all at once. Every kindness she'd trusted now needing to be re-examined for the angle from which it had actually been offered. Every conversation, she said slowly. Every night you sat with me. Was any of it real? All of it, Percy said, and for once there was no easy grin on his face at all, nothing but raw and frightened honesty. That's the part one don't think you're going to believe, but it's the truth. I was sent to watch you, and somewhere in 2 years of watching you, you stopped being an assignment and became my best friend, and I have spent every single day since not knowing what to do about that. His voice broke. They know what you are now. They know what the arena showed everyone. And they've decided the mistake that let your bloodline slip through wasn't your birth, Michaela. It was letting you live long enough to wake up. For a long moment neither of them said anything. Somewhere above the stacks a lantern guttered, throwing shifting shadows across the shelves of old Academy records, and Michaela found herself thinking, absurdly, of the wooden token with her birth month scratched into it, the only piece of her own history she'd ever been allowed to hold in her hands, and how little any of it had ever actually belonged to her. Why are you telling me now? She said finally. You could have just kept watching. I never would have known. Because I'm done being someone who watches you for a living instead of just being your friend, Percy said, voice raw. Because they're not going to wait much longer, and you deserve to hear it from someone who actually cares what happens to you, not from a council notice pinned to a door. He hesitated. You should tell Leo. Tonight, if you can. Whatever's between the two of you. It's about to matter a great deal more than either of you have let yourselves admit. She found Leo an hour later on the practice hall roof, where he'd started going most nights whether or not she was there, and told him everything in a voice that only shook twice. He listened without once interrupting, jaw tightening by degrees, and when she finished he was quiet for so long she thought, with a fresh stab of dread, that this, finally, after everything, might be the thing that sent him running back to the safety of who his father had raised him to be. Instead he took her hand carefully, like it was something that might break if he wasn't paying attention, and said, Then we stop waiting for them to decide what happens to you. We find out the truth before they can bury it again. Everything Professor Ilsa had been afraid to say outright, she finally said in full once the danger stopped being theoretical. The lineage seal, the ceremony every student walked through on their first day, the ritual that had defined every hierarchy at Aurelian for 300 years, had never been a neutral measurement of blood. It had been built deliberately by the great houses in the aftermath of an old war to keep one particular bloodline from ever rising to prominence again. A lineage that had once combined shifter strength and old magic in the same body, a combination the founding houses had decided, jointly and quietly, was too dangerous to ever be allowed to exist. Rather than hunt every last descendant to the ground and risk exposing what they'd done, they'd built a system that would keep any surviving heir buried under the label faint for their entire life, never trained, never noticed, never given the tools to understand what slept in their own blood. A mercy so cold it was really just a slower kind of erasure. The archive room Ilsa led them to was tucked behind a false shelf in the History of the Lost Houses office, a space so small and so cold that Michaela suspected it hadn't been opened by anyone but Ilsa in decades. Dust lay thick over crates of records nobody had thought worth cataloging, and the single high window let in barely enough moonlight to read by, forcing them to work by lantern, voices low, ears tuned for footsteps in the corridor outside. The seal on your line was never broken by accident, Ilsa told her, once she'd found the ledger she was looking for and laid it open across the table between them. Columns of old, cramped handwriting listing names Michaela didn't recognize beside dates 3 centuries gone. It broke because it was struck. Duels have always had that risk built into them, quietly, and I think on some level the old houses always knew it. They just gambled that no one bearing that blood would ever survive long enough, or come close enough to real danger, to trigger it. Her hand trembled slightly around her teacup. Leo's strike didn't create your power, child. It found the crack that was always going to be there, and it broke it open. Leo leaned over the ledger, frowning at a page marked with a seal he recognized. His own family's crest, half faded, beside 4 others he knew from history lessons he'd sat through without really listening. These are the founding signatures. My family's on here. Every great house that survived the long winter war is on that page, Ilsa said. They didn't just agree to seal one bloodline. They agreed never to speak of having done it to any child born into any of their houses ever again. I imagine your father doesn't know the whole of it either, Leo. I imagine he only knows the part that was useful to him, that a dangerous line was dealt with once a long time ago, and that keeping it dealt with was simply his family's duty. Nobody tells the next generation the parts that would make them ask hard questions. Michaela sat with that for a long time. So the whole ranking system, the whole reason people like me get put in the tower with the draft that never goes away, it was never really about power at all. It was about fear, Ilsa said simply. It has always, in every century, only ever been about fear. Ilsa's ledger named a place, the Undercroft, a sealed vault beneath the Hall of Lineage itself, built at the same time as the charter and never once opened since, where the founding houses had stored whatever proof remained of what they'd done. Getting to it meant getting past the one guardian the founders had trusted more than any lock, a creature old even by the Academy's standards, a great horned drake bound to the Undercroft's threshold by a Hayes, so old nobody living had ever seen it stir. It won't hurt us unless we lie to it, Ilsa warned, leading them down a spiral stair that hadn't seen a lit torch in years, her own lantern throwing long shadows against walls carved with names Michaela didn't recognize. That was always the old binding magic. A drake set to guard truth doesn't attack honesty. It attacks concealment. Which means, of everyone likely to attempt this vault in 300 years, the two of you may be the only visitors it's ever had who don't have something to hide from it. The drake met them at the bottom of the stair exactly as the old records described, vast, scaled in dull iron gray, eyes like twin banked coals, coiled around a door sealed with wax and old iron. It did not breathe fire, the way the storybook dragons in children's tales always did. It simply raised its head, slow and considering, and looked at each of them in turn with an attention that felt less like a monster sizing up prey and more like a magistrate weighing testimony. Name your purpose, it said, in a voice like stone grinding against stone, or leave the way you came. I want to know what was done to my bloodline, and why, Michaela said, holding perfectly still under that ancient gaze, refusing to let her voice shake. Not to use it as a weapon. Not to punish anyone for what their ancestors did. I just want to know the truth of what I am, because everyone before you has decided that was a decision that belonged to them instead of to me. The drake was silent for a long moment. Then, with a groan of shifting stone, it uncoiled from the doorway and lowered its great head until one iron-dark eye was level with hers. That, it said, is the first honest purpose anyone has brought to this door since it was sealed. It turned its gaze on Leo next. And you, Ashborn blood. Why do you stand beside her? Because I'm done letting my family decide who deserves the truth and who doesn't, Leo said. Including me. The drake considered that too, and then slowly drew back from the door entirely, coiling itself along the far wall instead, watching. Then go, it said. Truth was always meant to be found, not guarded forever. I have simply been waiting 300 years for someone honest enough to come looking for it. Inside the vault they found what the drake had guarded all that time. Not weapons. Not the dangerous relics the founding houses had always claimed they were protecting the world from, but records. Testimonies. Rows of sealed jars holding preserved petals from a flowering vine that, according to a brittle label in the same shaking hand, had once been used to close wounds no other healer's craft could touch. Diagrams of a rite that combined shifter breath with old magic light to break fevers that had, for generations before the sealing, simply been considered death sentences. A full accounting, written by one of the founders' own hands in the shaking, guilty script of someone who had never quite made peace with what he'd helped do, of exactly how the ancient royal line had actually behaved in the years before it was erased, not as tyrants, not as a threat to be contained, but as healers. As the last line able to knit shifter strength and old magic together into something that had once ended famines and closed plagues no other magic could touch, until the founding. Houses realized that a bloodline capable of that much good was also, by definition, capable of holding more power than any of them, and decided, in the coldest kind of fear, that shared safety mattered less than their own certainty of staying on top. Michaela lifted one of the jars carefully into the lantern light, watching dried petals shift and settle against old glass, and felt something in her chest settle along with them. Not triumph, exactly, and not even relief, but the quiet, steadying sense of finally being handed proof that the thing sleeping in her blood had once, long before anyone decided to fear it, simply been a way of helping people. They didn't erase a monster, Michaela said quietly, reading it by lantern light with Leo's shoulder warm against hers. They erased the one thing that could have made the world kinder than they wanted it to be. They didn't leave the Undercroft right away. Michaela sat a long while on the cold stone floor with the founder's testimony open across her knees, and for the first time since the arena, the thing she felt wasn't fear of her own power, or grief for a mother she hadn't met yet, or anger at 3 centuries of careful lies. It was something quieter and harder to name. The specific, dizzying vertigo of realizing that the person she might have been, if none of this had ever happened to her, was someone she would now never get the chance to meet. If they hadn't sealed it, she said slowly, I would have grown up knowing. Trained for it since I could walk the way you were. I wonder sometimes if I'd even recognize myself, standing next to who I actually turned out to be instead. I used to think I already knew exactly who I was going to be, Leo said, settling onto the stone beside her. Every day of my life mapped out before I was old enough to have an opinion about it. And then a girl on the floor of a corridor told me my footing might matter more than I thought, and it turns out that was the first true thing anyone ever said to me about myself. He took her hand, turning it over gently in his, tracing the calluses she'd earned running solitary drills in an empty yard nobody thought worth patrolling. I don't think you lost the chance to become someone else, Michaela. I think you spent 18 years quietly becoming someone the old houses never planned for and never could have predicted. And I happen to think she's better than whoever their version of you would have been. The drake, still coiled along the far wall, made a low sound that might, from a creature its size, have almost been described as approving. 300 years I have guarded this door, it rumbled, waiting to see what kind of person finally walked through it wanting the truth more than the power. I find I am satisfied with the wait. Michaela managed, despite everything, a small, unsteady laugh. Is that a compliment? It is the closest thing a drake gives, it said, to one. Word reached Leo's father the same night, carried by whichever quiet arm of the council answered to him first, and he came to the academy himself before dawn, which he had not done since the day he enrolled his son. He came alone, without his usual retinue, which Leo had learned long ago was the surest sign that whatever was about to be said was meant to happen where no one else could witness his father's temper, or his own. They met in the same training hall where Leo and Michaela had spent the last several weeks slowly, carefully, learning to trust each other. Commander Ashbourne stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the practice dummies pushed to one side, the 2 sets of footprints worn into the sand in overlapping patterns, before his gaze settled on his son with an expression Leo had spent his whole life learning to fear. You will end whatever this is, Commander Ashbourne told him in the cold, level voice he used for orders rather than requests, and you will do it tonight, or I will end it for you in a way neither of you will enjoy. Do you understand what that girl is? Do you understand what her bloodline did, the last time it was allowed to rise? I understand what I've been told it did, Leo said. I've started to understand there's a difference. She hasn't done anything, Leo said. She's not dangerous. She's the least dangerous person in this entire academy, and everyone keeps treating her like a weapon instead of a person, and I am done pretending that's acceptable just because it's convenient for you. Her bloodline burned down half a kingdom 300 years ago. Her bloodline was a family, Leo said and heard, for the first time in his life, his own voice not shake in front of his father. He thought, as he said it, of the ledger in Ilsa's archive, 5 house crests pressed into old wax beside a promise never to speak of what they'd done. The Ashbournes among them, alongside the Thorns and 3 other names that still sat on the council today, still collected the quiet privileges that came with having been on the winning side of a fear 3 centuries old. He thought of the founder's testimony in the vault beneath the Hall of Lineage, of famines ended and plagues closed by a bloodline that had asked for nothing in return except to be allowed to keep existing. You didn't seal away a weapon. You sealed away a family that made the rest of you feel small by comparison, and you've spent 300 years calling that mercy instead of what it actually was. His father's face went very still, The particular stillness Leo had spent 18 years learning to read as the calm directly before violence. You would choose her over your own house. I would choose what's right, Leo said. You spent my whole life telling me power was the only thing that mattered. You were wrong. It never was. It was always what you do with it that mattered, and you've spent your whole life doing nothing with yours except being afraid. It was the first time in either of their lives that Leo had ever refused his father anything, and it would not, as it turned out, be the last. Word of the council's intentions, quiet suppression, a second ceiling if Michaela could be contained, something far worse if she couldn't, moved through the academy faster than any official announcement ever could, the way true things always travel fastest through the people least expected to be listened to. It reached the Grain Tower first, the drafty dormitory full of every other student the mark had failed to properly measure, and something unexpected happened there. Instead of fear, it produced, slowly and then all at once, a kind of furious hope. If they got it wrong about you, one girl said, cornering Michaela in the tower stairwell, voice low and urgent. How many of the rest of us did they get wrong too? Michaela hadn't thought of it that way, hadn't had room to think of it that way, buried as she'd been in the sheer personal terror of her own unraveling identity. But once the question was asked, she couldn't stop hearing it. Every feint in that tower had been told, from their first day, that the dimness of their mark was simply the truth of them, unchangeable, unappealable. What if it wasn't the truth at all? What if it had only ever been a wall built high enough that nobody bothered checking what was on the other side of it? Percy, still raw with guilt, threw himself into finding out the answer with the same desperate focus he'd once used to watch Michaela for the council, and this time it was entirely, uncomplicatedly for her. Old suppression wards, he discovered from records buried in Ilsa's archive, had been quietly renewed on the whole faint dormitory every single year since the tower was built, not to protect the students inside it, as the official record claimed, but to keep whatever slept in some of their bloodlines exactly where the founding houses had left it 3 centuries ago. He worked through 3 sleepless nights cross-referencing ward renewal logs against the tower's occupancy rolls, and what he found made his hands shake the first time he laid it all out on the table in front of Michaela and the small, wary circle of faints who'd started gathering in her room after curfew. Not every suppressed line traced back to Michaela's ancient royal blood. Most honestly didn't. Power simply ran thin in some families the way height or eye color did. No conspiracy required. But a startling handful did not thin out at all. They simply stopped, abruptly, at a specific date 3 centuries back, the exact year the founding houses had signed their names to Ilsa's ledger, as though something had reached into those bloodlines and quietly turned the lights off. So some of us are just faint, said the girl from the stairwell whose name Michaela had finally learned was Talia. And some of us aren't faint at all. We're just muted. Muted, Percy repeated, and something in the words seemed to settle over the room like a held breath finally released. It was, everyone silently agreed, a far better word than the one they'd all grown up answering to. By the night of the council's final vote, the Grain Tower was no longer full of children who believed they were nothing. It was full of children who were starting, one by one, to ask what they might have been all along, and who had, every one of them, decided they were done waiting quietly to find out. News of the Undercroft's opened vault reached the council within a day, carried, ironically, by one of the same quiet watchers who had once reported on Michaela for a living. Except this time the report went not to the houses that wanted the truth buried, but to the handful of council members who had spent years quietly uneasy about a charter none of them had been alive to actually witness being written. The council split, publicly and messily, for the first time in longer than anyone could remember. House Wren, no relation to the professor, though she made her own sympathies known loudly enough that several nobles assumed otherwise, argued that 3 centuries of unexamined law was reason enough to open the whole charter to review, vault or no vault. House Voss, old and cautious, argued the opposite, that whatever the founders had done, they had done it to prevent a war, and undoing it now, however sympathetically, risked repeating whatever catastrophe had made it seem necessary in the first place. You didn't see what she did in that arena, Voss's representative said. At a session Ilsa insisted on attending uninvited, dragging Michaela along at the back of the room where she could listen without being seen. You didn't feel it. I did, Leo said from where he stood at his father's side, present at the session for reasons Commander Ashbourne had not yet fully explained even to himself. I felt it before anyone else in that arena did. It didn't feel like a weapon aimed at me. It felt like something waking up that had been asleep too long and didn't know yet what it wanted to be. That's not the same thing as a threat. You've spent 300 years treating the two as identical because it was easier than finding out which one was true. The session ended without a vote, which Ilsa called, wearily, the closest thing to a victory anyone was likely to get on the first attempt. Change this old rarely happens all at once, she told Michaela afterward, over tea gone cold in her small office. It happens because enough people in the room stop being certain of the old answer, one at a time, until the certainty that's left isn't enough to hold the law up anymore. You've already put more cracks in 300 years of silence than anyone managed before you. Be patient a little longer. The rest is coming. It came in the end, faster than even Ilsa expected, because Commander Ashbourne, walking out of that session beside a son who had just argued down half the council without raising his voice once, found himself, for the first time in years, uncertain of anything at all. The council convened its final session in the Varia arena itself, the same white bowl of stone where the whole unraveling had started, because the old charter required disputes over bloodline law to be settled in the place where blood was tested. Torches ringed the seats. Every noble house in the region had sent a representative, and this time no one had come for spiced nuts and easy theater. The mood in the stands was closer to the hush before a storm, restless and watchful. Kasha Thorne sat near the front with her family, arms folded, her earlier delight nowhere in evidence. Whatever she'd expected this term to become, it clearly hadn't been this. Commander Ashbourne sat in the front row, jaw tight, watching his own son stand at the center of the sand beside the girl he'd been ordered to abandon. The fate known as Michaela, the council's spokesman announced, in the flat formal voice reserved for verdicts, carries a bloodline this council has ruled, by ancient charter, unsafe for continuation. The charter provides for resealing, by force if resistance is offered. Then you'll have to offer it to all of us, said a voice from the stands, and Michaela turned to see the entire grain tower on its feet, every faint student in the academy standing together in the moss-eaten seats, faces set. Because we did the reading, too. Every single suppression ward on that tower has someone's name on it. You don't get to unseal one of us and call it a mistake to be corrected. You have to answer for all of it. Ilsa Corvain rose next, older and steadier than Michaela had ever seen her, and read aloud, in a clear, carrying voice, the note that had been destroyed the week Michaela was found, the one she had memorized 40 years ago and never once let herself forget, no matter how many times she'd been ordered to. A mother's plea. A mother's love. A family erased not because it had ever done anything wrong, but because it had once, 300 years ago, dared to be strong enough to be feared. And Leo, Alpha Heir, bronze-marked, the brightest mark the Arch had produced in 100 years, stepped forward and, in front of his own father and every house that had ever mattered to him, said the only thing he had left that was entirely his own to give. I refuse the charter, he said. Not as the Ashbourne heir. As myself. If you seal her, you seal me standing in front of her. A murmur ran through the stands, sharp and startled, and Commander Ashbourne rose halfway out of his seat as though to physically drag his son back from the edge of something. Kasha's mouth had fallen open, all her earlier certainty gone clean out of her face. The council's spokesman looked, for the first time all evening, genuinely uncertain of the script he was supposed to be reading from. You would forfeit your house, the spokesman said slowly, for a foundling. I would forfeit anything built on a lie this old, Leo said, for a person who never should have had to spend 18 years not knowing who she was. That's not a hard choice. I don't understand why you all keep acting like it is. Beside him, Michaela reached out and laced her fingers through his, in full view of every noble house on the continent, and felt him grip her hand back like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Whatever happened next, she thought, at least she wouldn't be facing it the way she'd faced everything else at Aurelian, alone in a tower with a draft that never fully went away, waiting for someone to finally decide what she was worth. It should not have worked. Charters 3 centuries old do not, as a rule, bend for 2 18-year-olds and a tower full of faints and one very stubborn old professor who had spent 40 years quietly regretting her silence. But charters are only ever as strong as the fear that built them, and fear, once it is looked at directly in daylight, by enough people at once, has a way of losing most of its power very quickly. The way a shadow loses its menace the moment someone finally lights a lamp and shows you it was only ever a coat on a hook. It was not a single dramatic collapse. It was the council, faced with an arena full of witnesses and a united front of houses no longer willing to simply agree with whatever the oldest families decided, choosing slowly and grudgingly that resealing a bloodline in front of that many nobles was a worse political cost than admitting, quietly, that the charter had outlived whatever purpose it once served. Commander Ashbourne, watching his son refuse to move from Michaela's side no matter what was threatened, made his own quiet calculation about which mattered more to him, the old order, or the only child he had left, and, for the first time in longer than he could remember, chose differently than fear would have chosen for him. The lineage seal ceremony was rewritten within the month, though rewriting 3 centuries of habit took considerably longer than rewriting the charter itself. The Grain Tower's suppression wards were the first to come down, unraveled one by one in a small quiet ceremony that Ilsa insisted on presiding over herself, tears openly running down her face as 40 years of guilt finally found somewhere to go. Some feints, it turned out, really had simply been feint. Power runs unevenly through every bloodline, always has, always will, and there was no shame in that either, whatever the old system had taught everyone to believe. But not all of them. Percy's family line, once fully unblocked, showed a shifter strain nobody had recorded in generations, and he spent a full week walking around the academy in a daze, catching sight of his own reflection like he didn't quite recognize it yet. Talia discovered that she could do things with growing things that made the academy's herbalism instructor weep with joy, vines answering her voice like they'd been waiting their whole lives for someone to finally ask. Cassia Thorne, for her part, never did apologize, not directly, not in words, but she stopped sitting at the front of every audience where Michaela was involved, and once, in a corridor neither of them expected the other in, she said stiffly, without quite meeting Michaela's eyes, "You held your ground better than I would have," which was, from Cassia, very nearly the same thing. Months later, at the Reformed Council's first open testing day, Cassia stood in line with every other student in her year. No exceptions made for her family name, and when her own mark came back exactly as bright as it always had been, she looked, for just a moment, almost disappointed that there hadn't been a single hidden thing about herself left to find. The academy itself changed slower than any single person in it, the way institutions always do. Old habits of deference lingering in small unconscious ways long after the law that had justified them was gone. But the Grain Tower's residents stopped calling themselves feints among themselves within the year, trading the word, quietly and without ceremony, for one Talia had first used in that lantern-lit room, unproven, which carried in it the plain, stubborn promise of a question still being answered, rather than a verdict already handed down. And Michaela stood in the courtyard on the first day of the following term, no longer at the very back of the line, watching a new crop of nervous first-years walk beneath the arch of origin, and understood, finally and completely, that the light that had once told her she was nothing had simply never been asked the right question. They still talk at Aurelian about the year the ranking duel went wrong, though most people these days have quietly stopped calling it wrong at all. The old Grain Tower has a new name now, chosen by its own residents. The Kindled Wing, in honor of every bloodline it turned out had simply been waiting, patiently, in the dark, for someone to bother asking what it might become. Leo trains every morning, though these days it's not to prove anything to his father, who has, slowly and perfectly, in the halting way people change when they've spent a lifetime being wrong about something that mattered, started to become someone Leo can almost imagine respecting again. Commander Ashbourne never did become a warm man, not in any way that would have surprised the son who grew up under his exacting hand, but he began, in small and grudging increments, to ask Leo questions instead of only issuing him corrections, and once, watching Leo and Michaela spar in the yard at dawn, he said nothing at all, which from a man who had never once let a flaw pass without comment, felt, to Leo, like the loudest kind of approval he had ever been given. Leo trains because Michaela is faster than she used to be, and stubborn as ever about it, and because there is nowhere else in the world he'd rather be at dawn than across the sand from her, both of them laughing more than either of them used to know how to. Michaela still climbs to the top of the old Grain Tower some nights, not because she has to anymore, but because the view from up there, the whole academy spread out below, Every dormitory full of students who are finally being allowed to find out what they're actually capable of has become the thing she loves best about the place that once told her she was nothing at all. The Arch of Origins still stands at the courtyard gate. It still flickers sometimes for students whose blood carries more questions than the old system ever thought to ask. Nobody calls it a faint reading anymore. These days, the professors have started calling it something else instead, unwritten. She found her mother in the spring, in a quiet coastal village 3 weeks' ride from Aurelian, living under a name that wasn't her own in a small house that smelled of salt and dried lavender. Not so different, Michaela thought, from Ilsa's office, as though the women who had spent their lives protecting her had all independently arrived at the same small comfort. Leo rode with her the whole 3 weeks and waited outside at a respectful distance when they finally reached the door, understanding without being told that some doors only fit one person crossing them for the first time. Aloan cried before Michaela had said a single word, the particular helpless crying of someone who has spent 18 years rehearsing an apology and fines, when the moment finally comes, that none of the words are big enough. She was smaller than Michaela had imagined, gray coming in early at her temples, hands rough from years of village healer's work, ordinary, entirely ordinary, in exactly the way her letter had once wished so desperately for her daughter to be. "I told myself every year that I'd send word once it was safe," she said when she could finally speak. "It was never safe. I kept telling myself that meant I was protecting you, and some days I still believe that, and some days I think I was only ever protecting myself from finding out I'd waited too long." "You didn't wait too long," Michaela said, and found to her own surprise that she meant it entirely. "You gave me 18 years to become someone before the whole world decided who I had to be instead. I don't think I would have survived what came after if you hadn't given me that first." They did not fix 18 years of separation in a single afternoon. Grief and relief do not resolve themselves that neatly, and Michaela was old enough now to know better than to expect they would. But they started, sitting together at a small wooden table with tea gone cold between them, trading the shapes of two lives that had run parallel and unknown to each other for far too long, which Michaela had come to understand was really all any beginning ever was. Percy graduated a full rank above where anyone had ever expected him to land and took a position, half to everyone's surprise and half to no one's, teaching first years the same locks and lanterns tricks he'd once used to survive being nobody in particular, because, he said, somebody needed to be in the grain tower who remembered what it felt like from the inside, and who could be trusted to actually be who he said he was. Tasha Thorne, against every prediction anyone would have made of her a year earlier, became one of the loudest voices on the newly reformed council, arguing for a full retesting of every student's mark on the grounds, spoken, when pressed, in her usual bored and pointed tone, that she'd rather know exactly how strong she really was than spend one more year resting on a rank that might turn out to be built on the same old like everyone else's had been. And on the evening of the first Lantern Festival held after the charter's fall, Leo found Michaela by the same old well, another blank lantern in her hands, and didn't ask what she meant to write on it this time. He simply stood beside her, shoulder to shoulder, the way he had 100 times since the night the arena first tried to teach them they were opposites, and waited. She wrote his name beside her own, small and steady, and released it into a sky that no longer needed anyone's permission to be full of light. Which is, Michaela has come to think, a far better word for a beginning than an ending ever was.